It's really nice to be here, and I must tell you, although this venue is very impressive, it's also very intimidating. But I will try my best not to be intimidated. When Jacob asked me to talk about the past, the present, and the future of the ISSL, I thought, how on earth do I speak on a conference? Then I just decided, perhaps, and I must say, as a good service learning scholar, I really reflected on this. And I thought, wow, how do you speak on a conference about the past? Because that will keep you busy for at least 3 or 4 hours. My colleagues who knows me know once you get me going, I don't stop. So I thought, perhaps we must use this time to look at the ISSL, the path that we've come, but really focus on the future. And as we all know, service learning is embedded in a university, is normally part of community engagement. And if I say community engagement, it has a lot of other names as well. And I thought perhaps we must look at service learning from that angle and see what is the future of service learning and the whole idea of community engagement in higher education. One of the things that we also worked into the name or the title of this conference, Service Learning as a Response to Global Transitions. But I must tell you, actually, at that time when we started conceptualizing this, it was disruptions, especially in South Africa. So we chose a more subtle word for that. And then I think looking at transforming higher education, but I think also the focus on social impact. And perhaps that is what I would like to bring, perhaps set the scene for this conference and talk a little bit about social impact as well. So what I would really like to do is just to perhaps look at the ISSL, but also in a way being a bit critical about community engagement and civic engagement. And then I would love to give you some theoretical perspectives on the idea of university societal engagement. In other words, from the micro to the more macro. And then specifically with the idea of enacting social impact. So hopefully the framework will stimulate our thoughts and just get us thinking a little bit about what is it that we want to do with this conference, and how do we propose that we have a transformative impact on higher education when we leave this conference. So when we look at the past conferences of ISSL, you will see a very interesting pattern. And now I'm going to be, of one of our icons in South Africa for women's rights. She had a stroke and she couldn't talk a lot. She found it very difficult to talk. And she said, I will talk about the important things and you have to read. So I almost want to say you have to read. And I will try just to highlight some of the things. So when we started off with this conference, I think both Phyllis and I didn't really had an idea what we were getting ourselves into. And we thought, well, let's start off with something like inter-community, interdisciplinary, and international. And the idea really was to sit around a table with about 30 people, just to start thinking about this, thinking about service learning, looking at how can it bring communities together, how can it be interdisciplinary, how can it bring scholars together, and how can it be international. I think at that stage, the conference, something like 120 people turned up. And we knew this was going to be something special. So, as you can see, we really worked through all the sort of different foci of service learning, and in the end, we realized that we are bringing people from across the globe together, and that we must really seek to look at the local, how the local can inform and impact on the global. And I think now we are really at a mature stage where we look at ourselves as a movement and as something that actually can transform communities as well as higher education. So this conference, if we look at the title, then when I was reflecting, I thought, well, so how can we, what does this mean for us as scholars in community engagement and service learning? And I think what we've seen across the world is that higher education is transforming, but those issues that are very important and that comes to the fore every time we talk about higher education and how it impacts on society is the whole thing of the relevance of our knowledge. That is one of the things that we need to look at. Whom do we have in the eye if we create knowledge? How do we do this with societal partners? The other one is access. In a country like South Africa, where we found that higher education across the world, there's a massification of access to higher education. In South Africa, we have not reached the point of massification. Why? Because we cannot give people access to higher education. Higher education is very expensive, and people who don't have the money do not get access to higher education. So I think access is also one of those crucial points that we need to look on if we think about community engagement. And then lastly, leadership issues. And I must tell you that these three issues, these 3 points, are actually the focus of the Tolwa Network Conference this year in Mexico. It was very interesting for us to hear that one of our leadership in our university said, you know what, the economic demise of the world, we should actually take responsibility for it as higher education, because we produce the leaders who are running the economic in the world, the economic environment in the world. And I think so it is with leadership as well. I don't want to mention leaders, but we all know South Africa is in a leadership crisis in our government. There are other African countries that has the same. I'm not sure how the Americans feel about their president, but we won't go there for the moment. So, the questions that I want to ask is, have community engagement changed or transformed higher education? But more important, do higher education make a difference in society and make society a more just and equal place to live? And then the last question, if we reflect on our title, what do we mean by social impact? What is social impact? I would really just like to look at a few perspectives on this. If I have the time, Lorraine, if your eyes go bigger, I know that I have to.
And I can watch.
Oh. Okay, so when we think critically about community engagement, I think possibly this is what we all say, if we say, please tell me in 2 sentences what is community engagement, we would say that globally universities contribute to the common good through commonly accepted the 3 functions of teaching, research, and community engagement. So we say it's one of our 3 core functions. And then the second one is partnerships, the reciprocal relationship between university and society. And I think that's the general idea that we have on community engagement. But community engagement as such also is problematic. And I call it the many faces of the 3rd function. And sometimes it leads to conflicting debates about what is community engagement. Some people say it's scholarly based. Other people say it's outreach and service. Is it 3 core functions or is it 2? Is it teaching, research, and community engagement? Is it only teaching and research? The definition, the terms that we use, civic engagement, community interaction, social responsiveness. Our teaching and learning, community-based learning, service learning, community service learning, and so many others as well. Collaborative research, community-based research, action research. And sometimes we wonder, which is it? And the conclusion is that community engagement is conceptualized institutionally. And across the world, it seems to be a problem to find one term that suits everyone. Perhaps we shouldn't have one term, but those are some of the issues that come up in community engagement. So, in South Africa specifically, one of the things that we really grapple with is the conceptual clarity around university community engagement. One of the questions that comes up in every conference on community engagement is what constitutes the community of a university? And then we come to the conclusion that community is actually an elusive concept and it must be contextualized. So each university sees its community different. And that might be problematic for a common understanding. Also in South Africa specifically, and it might be the same in other countries, the misconception that community refers to black people, to poor people, to historical, sometimes it's due to historical guilt. Sometimes it has a religious base or a religious sort of paternalism. And so on. And I think what sometimes happens is that when people think about community engagement, they think about the deficit approach of there is nothing, so we need to bring something. And I think those are some of the issues that come up. Also, and what I really liked about President Brown's talk is that specifically that it seemed like NUI looks a lot broader to, where it impacts, not only on civil society and in the narrow sort of, vicinity of the university, but also on a meso and a macro level. And I think that is some of the things that we grapple with. The other one is the silo effect, and all of us, I'm sure, has had the problem that teaching is teaching, research is research, and community engagement is this peripheral function of the university. I'm deliberately problematizing this because I think what we are doing, or those of us who are here, are probably the converted, and we think different about community engagement. But what I think is problematic is that it's almost in a university, the us and the them. Those who do community engagement and those who don't do community engagement. And I'm just wondering, why are we not all doing community engagement? Why do universities not do community engagement as universities and not just the scholars who has a passion about it? The gains of community engagement, I think, are very obvious. And all of us who are sitting here probably knows this, that in community engagement there are values, there are modalities that we've developed over time. One of the great things is that the developmental role of higher education has become illuminated in community engagement. All of us aspires to become agents of change. And what we hear across the world is, for instance, that people develop solidarity with social groups in society. If we look at the Argentinian model, you will find that in Argentina, universities go into communities and they actually become part of that community. They become part of the politics. They become part of the economics in that particular community. Some of the values that have been emphasized is the idea of respect for the wisdom and knowledge that exist in a community. The whole idea of co-creation of knowledge, but also to see people in social groups, in society, as being equals, and not being the expert in that environment. The question that I'm asking is, does this happen? Do we actually make a difference when we do community engagement? Are universities catalysts for social change and for social justice? And the other question is, how do we evaluate and how do we impact? So what I would like to do is just to offer a proposed framework for us to look into the future of where are we going with community engagement and service learning. So the framework that I want to propose is firstly to look at university societal engagement and not community engagement. To look at the more macro level of with whom do we interact, with whom do we work? Do we just work with those who are in and around the town or the area where our university is situated? Or do we look further? And then specifically, how do we enact social impact? So I don't want to claim that this is the only way of thinking about it. But I think at Stellenbosch University, this has really helped us to think more deeper and wider on what is it that we as an institution are doing in society and how are we impacting on the world around us. So the first thing that the framework that I will talk about is symbolic interactionism and in a meaning-making context as basis of university societal engagement. Then the whole idea of social fields, which can be an alternative for talking about communities, practices and the building of social capital, systemic change towards the development goals to evaluate impact, scholarship and citizenship as vehicles of social impact, and then the culture of collaboration within the university. So I'm going to start off talking about the theoretical basis. And as I say, I don't want to claim that this is the only way to think about it, but I think it's something that we can take forward and see how it fits into our context And does this make sense for us to really come to a point where we look at a wider and perhaps a deeper engagement with society? So, university societal engagement as symbolic interactionism. Now, the theory of interactionism, and I'm sure that there are sociologists here who knows the theory, implies that people who share the same interests are drawn to each other and interact on a regular basis, and that they form social fields. Now, what is different about social fields and what we see as communities is that social fields are permeable, it has a fluid structure, and people can come and go. And the whole idea is that individuals will not leave the structure if there is a structural coupling with their ideas and what they think. Also, social fields that are related may connect and form a community field, which is an interrelated group of social fields with the same fluidity. Now, when you think of health as a possible community field, then it might be that one social field would be mothers with babies. It might be expecting mothers. It might be youth health issues. So those type of areas where people normally focus. In South Africa, one of the fields where people, especially in health, work together is in HIV and AIDS. Something like autism would be a social field. And I think basically what is different here when we talk about social fields is that in social symbolic interactionism, underlying to that interacting, there is a symbolism. And that symbolism is normally formed by the values, by common values and common beliefs, and people working towards the same goal. When we come back to university, universities can actually interact with many social fields at once due to the multiplicity of interests in a university. And also in the different faculties and divisions. So what can happen really with the social field is that in one community, there can be different social fields where people actually interact. And when one brings those groups of people together and they start working together, that is where the social impact comes in. And not just in one community or one specific interaction. Then social impact. I think that's one of the questions that people ask when they hear that Stellenbosch University do not use the term community engagement, but social impact. Now, when I did research on social impact, because I must tell you, when we started off with social impact, it was foreign to me too. And I looked into the theory of social impact. And Latan says that social impact is the result of social forces in a force field or a social structure. And social forces will have an impact according to their strength, immediacy, and the number of sources operating at the same time. And social impact is based upon the principle that people influence other people, and the biggest number of people who drive the hardest at an issue will be successful. Now that can be positive and negative, because you can actually cause domination if it happens like that. But it can also be positive, where people who have a particular lifestyle, who live healthy, can influence other people also to live healthy. And this is what social impact is. So, if we have to take a shot at a definition, it is any of the great variety of changes in physiological states, subjective feelings, motives and emotions, cognitions and beliefs, values and behavior that occur in an individual, human or animal, as the result of the real, implied or imagined presence of actions of other individuals. So that is really the bottom line of social impact. So, social impact, like I say, can have a negative meaning in higher education, because we can go back to the idea of universities impacting on society. But I think if we think about social impact in terms of being reciprocal, that gives us a different view of what social impact is and can be. So I want to argue that reciprocal impact in higher education is an imperative. So from an institutional perspective, and this came from Australia, from an Australian writer, and she says that social impact does not only refer to the experience and the impact by individuals, but the impact of an organization as a whole. And sometimes I wonder if we as universities sometimes know about what other people are doing in our own university. And do we know what our university as a whole is doing in society? Also, the fact that if an organization has impact, it should be embedded in the hosting context at both an individual and an organizational level. So what I want to argue is that if universities really want to live, to have impact, my sense is that we need to look at a more holistic way of looking at our engagement with society, and specifically through engaged scholarship and engaged citizenship. And I'm going to very shortly just quickly talk about that. But before I go there, one of the things that works in an institution is that we have practices. And if we want to have social impact as an institution, we need to develop practices that are conducive to social impact. And this is what I mean by practices, embodied materially mediated ways of human activity. I think that's something that is very much ingrained in our universities. So I think what we need to do is to look at how our practices can develop social capital, and social capital is those connections between people where they actually develop these understandings and work towards goals. So I'm going to try and go a little bit faster. I'm not going to talk a lot about social capital, but it's based on trust, reciprocity, agency, bonding and bridging social capital. And we know that social capital can be built in different spheres of society. So I want to offer a definition for social impact in higher education. And I think one of the most important things is that when we look at social impact should be the evaluable change that universities incur in society. Through our collaboration with others, on the grounds of our tacit knowledge and our scholarly expertise, and then also innovative and excellent practices, like I've said before. So I'm going to skip that one. What I would like to say is, so if we as universities want to have social impact, how do we measure that? What is it that we work towards? And what we did at Stellenbosch is to look at the Sustainable Development Goals And when you look at these goals, and you look at your own country's development goals, and even in the area where you live, you will find that there is an articulation between the local, the national, and even the international. So what we've done is developed different themes of development goals. So every person who teaches or who does research in Stellenbosch will measure themselves against the Sustainable Development Goals and how they contribute to those goals. And here you can see the first theme that we have is employment and inclusive economic development, social justice, education for all, resources and infrastructure, environment and sustainability, safety, security and good governance, and partnerships like we have. And food security and health. So those are the 7 themes that one can actually extract from the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm sure that in other universities there can be others. So how do we evaluate? What we've developed is the logic model of evaluation. And I think what we normally did in community engagement and service learning is really coming to the outputs. But when we looked at those sustained significant change that happens in an environment because of all these initiatives running there, then there should be a systemic change in that environment. And this is what we call the impacts. So we have the inputs, we have our activities, we have the outputs, and then those goals that we envisage are the outcomes, and the impacts are those permanent changes that happen. So to end off, I would like to talk about scholarship, engaged scholarship and engaged citizenship. But I think if we, Lorraine? Okay, thanks. So I think this is, again, perhaps more well-known territory, so I can go a little bit faster through that. But I think the idea of really tying our impact to everything we do in a university, and that doesn't mean that we just do what we do and now we have impact, but I think it is the way that we do it. It's not business as usual. And engaged scholarship is something that we know. All of us have seen Boyer's definition of the scholarship of engagement, where we have the scholarship of teaching, of discovery, the application, and the integration. But I think if we look closer to the idea of engaged scholarship is a sort of, it's a different concept. It's more the way that we do our scholarship. And normally there would be one or more scholarships involved in engaged scholarship. It could be teaching, it could be research, it could be both. So that is what I really mean by engaged scholarship. And then engaged citizenship is what we know as volunteerism, as the co-curricular activities in our universities. And engaged citizenship, an engaged citizen is an active, responsible citizen cognizant of the challenges in society and plays an active role to solve them. And I think here we are talking about developing our students as citizens to develop graduate attributes, but at the same time also, when they graduate, to go out into society and be engaged, keep being engaged, whatever their profession is in society. And then just lastly, more or less an institutional model with what is social impact And I think when we look at engaged scholarship as being engaged teaching and learning, which includes service learning, which includes work-integrated learning, which includes problem-based learning, engaged research, which can be collaborative or should be collaborative, but there are a wide array of methodologies, engaged citizenship, staff volunteerism, outreach and public service, and co-curricular activities of students, and then, of course, special cross-cutting programs through sport, through culture, and so on. But still having those two things at the base of that engagement, which is societal interaction and partnerships. Thanks.